It is conference season, and one of the big draws for any conference is, hey, who's given the keynote? If you've ever wondered how those folks made it onto the main stage, today we have some answers because I'm talking to Ryan Vett. So Ryan Vett is an international keynote speaker, a USA Today bestselling author, and a member of the $1 Million Speakers Group, a distinction reserved for top earning speakers. So today he gives us some insight into how to build a professional speaking business. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a 4-time author, Emmy award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. Ryan Vett, welcome to Speaker Dynamics Own the Room. We are happy you are here. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Karin, thank you so much for having me.
So I'm excited to talk to you about something that I get a lot of requests about. People will say, hey, Karin, I want to get into this professional speaking circuit. How do I do that? And my answer is, I don't know. So I'm looking forward to talking to somebody who actually has lived it. And you've even wrote a book about it called, Speak Goodr, which it's Goodr, which I think is very funny. But before we get into that, I just wanted to have our listeners and our viewers understand how you got from point A to point B. So your journey to becoming a professional speaker was not linear. Tell us a little bit about that.
It was not linear at all. I'm entrepreneurial through and through, from a lemonade stand as a kid all the way to being in the venture-backed startup world for some time. And so dealt with companies that were worth negative millions of dollars, as well as that were valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. So I've seen a lot of different levels and sizes of companies and organizations, but all through that, one of my personal goals has always been to inspire others towards a positive change, whether that's through the products and services that I get behind, or whether that's speaking and consulting and coaching. So that's always been somewhere in my journey. But like you said, my journey wasn't linear. When I was in high school, actually, it was around the rise of Twitter and YouTube and all of social media. I really quickly amassed like 1,000 Twitter followers, which then was a big deal.
Like, how did that happen?
Because I was early on the platform and someone had to follow somebody. And so the recommendations, there weren't many recommendations. So I was, the bottom of the barrel, but I grew this following pretty quickly. And all of a sudden, people started thinking that I knew what I was talking about because at that point in time, you just got the latest leadership quotes that you could find and tweet, 2 a day. And that's just how Twitter worked back in the early 2000s. So did that and was asked to speak to a group of realtors on why millennials aren't buying houses. And again, at this point now, I'm about a year into college. So I'm an expert on house buying and millennials. And so I took the gig. And that was kind of my first professional engagement, if you will. But all along, having done entrepreneurial ventures, having started a company as an earlier teen, I was really focused on leadership books, and I loved listening to leadership speakers. And someday I knew that was probably always the journey or the path and where I wanted to end up. So anyway, spoke a few times professionally, if you will. I got paid for them. 2 of them are in the book. And then I took what I call like a 10 to 12 year hiatus, just being in the venture-backed world. I'd have a couple gigs a year, but it wasn't a focus. And then in 2020, when a lot of people did self-reflection, I had a big exit event in a company. And I kind of drew a line in the sand and said, hey, from now on, what I really want to focus on is inspiring others towards a positive change, what I had written almost 15 years earlier on a piece of paper. And the way that I now have the ability and freedom to do that is speaking and professional speaking. And that's what I'm going to invest the majority of my time in. And so the rest is history, my spaghetti journey all the way to sort of where I drew a line in the sand, 2020, 2021. And here we are today.
Yeah, I love you referring to that as a spaghetti journey because I always feel like we are the sum of our parts. And, I never envisioned that I would end up here. But like you, the mantra that I always had was be a force for good in whatever you're doing. And that's what I relate to my children. Whatever you're doing, be a force for good. So I feel that very deeply, and I love how it's been reflected in your journey. So let's talk a little bit about the book. So you call it a speaker mishap anthology, which is hilarious. Why did you decide to write it?
I was going to, and I actually have a manuscript almost complete, called So You Want to Speak. And it was going to be my journey of how to build a speaking business. And I looked out there, and there are so many great resources out there already on building a speaking business, but none of them that I felt actually went deep into what really happens when you're out there. I went to business school, both undergrad and graduate, and you get all this theory, but until you're there, the crazy things that happen in business, like, I'm sorry, I sit on the board of a pretty esteemed business school, so I'm not knocking education, but they can't teach you in the classroom what you learn in the school of hard knocks. So I wrote the book for two reasons. One, because I felt that the true, honest, here's what happens was missing. I think the second piece of it was really, as a speaker, humor is a big part of what you need to incorporate. Now, you don't have to be a comedian, and I think that's a big misconception.
Yes.
But especially when you're doing heavier talks or deep leadership talks, there are ways to interject humor, and my humor is very sarcastic, which is not always great, especially when I'm talking about generational dynamics, and I'm talking about, the 9 things you're not supposed to talk about at work. And I'm talking about that. So you have to incorporate humor in an appropriate way. And so this book is way uncomfortable for my writing style. Like, I do not write this way. It's slapstick. It is, there's different colored words in there and different fonts to make it just unique. And it was a challenge for myself. And so part of this was, learning at everyone else's expense. I had to read my learning to try to be humorous.
Let's share some of those humorous stories. So, many of them seem to come from tech foibles, which I've experienced some of them that you mentioned in your book. Is there one that comes to mind that was just kind of like, I can't believe this is happening?
Yeah,
I'm sure you got many.
Yeah, there's stuff that happens all the time, right? Like, I just got off a plane yesterday and had a big tech mishap. My slides automatically advanced themselves, just kept going.
Oh, no.
And I'm watching on, and I'm standing on there's 2 screens on either side, and I've got the monitor in front of me. Well, the monitor's not updating, and I'm just seeing in my periphery. And thankfully, I'm talking about generations, and I made a joke about time travel, right? I'm like, as we're time traveling here, are you guys seeing, and so you just bring in, and I said, who needs slides anyway? Those are so archaic, and you just make a joke and you go with it, and I think that's a big part of it. But one of my favorite stories here in the book is the disco story. And it's a completely true story. And I actually played it down for the book. My editor was like, yeah, this is too outrageous. But I'm basically standing at a conference for a state association. And I go to my room, and this was on the exhibit hall floor, which sometimes they do. Not my favorite place to present, but hey, you know what? You take the gig if that's what you sign up for.
Yeah.
And so I'm presenting, and it's this big glass fishbowl, and it seats maybe 75 people. So it's a pretty small breakout room. This is not a keynote, right? This is a training. And as people are getting scanned in for their badges, they're being handed a headset. And I'm like, this is really interesting. And I've done international things where translation is through headsets, and, for hearing impaired, sometimes they'll do that. So there's a lot of times where I've seen this, but I'm like, every single person. So I talked to the meeting professional who hired me. I said, hey, just want to make sure, did I miss something? And she's like, oh no, because it's so loud on the exhibit hall floor, even though you're in this glass fishbowl, we want to make sure everyone has these headsets. Okay. So I get up there, and I've got this little tiny speaker. And so I can hear myself through the microphone, which is a very, very strange phenomenon. No one likes to hear themselves anyway. It's just a hazard of being a speaker. Yeah. And I start presenting. Well, the stage that I'm on, like it's like, the mountains of Pennsylvania. It's super hilly. And every time I move at all on the stage, the screen starts to flash, and it just like strobes, like a strobe light. And so I don't say anything to it, and I'm just kind of letting it go. Well, that becomes distracting. The audio becomes distracting. I have no idea if people are listening to, their music, or if they're listening to me talk. And someone goes and gets the AV guy who comes up on stage and literally starts standing in front of me, like looking at the screen and trying. And then he's like stomping around on the stage. Then he goes and pulls my computer. It's just like unbelievable. And I keep going. I just keep going.
Because you have no choice,
laughing.
Ryan. Like, what are you going to do? Right.
Yeah. I'm like, I'm paid to be here. This is my only session. Like I'm going to get this information into their minds. Hopefully they're listening to me. And we had a good laugh about it. And the meeting professional did come up afterwards. And she's like, in the 20 years of me being a meeting professional, I've not seen anything like that, nor anyone handle it like that. I'm like, hey, this stuff happens and I'm here to deliver a message. So whatever is going around me, you just have to keep going. And unless safety is an issue. And then, so that's probably the wildest AV story.
That's amazing. But I also love how you mentioned the importance of being very thankful for the people who are helping you with the AV and being mindful that your brand speaks beyond the stage. And so all of your interactions, you consider to be pivotal. Why was that something that you knew instinctively was part of who you wanted to be, as a speaking professional?
Yeah, I think there's two or three ways that I could answer that. One, I did AV for a long time. I was in theater growing up, and I was both on the stage and behind the scenes, and I loved AV. And really, AV has a lot of control. They've got that magic mute button, and they're rarely seen, but they make it happen. You only know they're there when something goes wrong. And so I always try to honor them. And then part of it is just honoring people. That's a big part of my presentation, and putting people first and really valuing the people that we interact with every single day. And so that's a big part of it. I mean, it amazes me. They always come in, check your mic, do whatever. But when you say, hey, what's your name? Especially if they're not wearing a name tag. That happened earlier this week. I met a guy named Carlo, and I'm like, Carlos? He's like, no, Carlo. I said, oh, great to meet you. He's like, thanks for knowing my name. And I was like, well, yeah, you have to make me sound good, so I can't be here without you. And it's just amazing how often people just are treated like the person that hits buttons behind, and they're so much more valuable than that. And so it's just important.
Yeah. I always think about it, as reflecting that your mother raised you right. It's just being a good person. Like but I love that you mentioned that and stress that, because it is true. Like if you are thinking that you're all that in a bag of chips and you don't need to treat, others with the respect that they deserve, that absolutely rubs me wrong. So I love that you talked about that in the book. So let's actually give people some insight into how to become a professional speaker. If somebody is just, clamoring for this job, like what do you tell them to do? How do they get off the ground? How do they start?
Yeah, I think the first piece of advice I've told is discouraging, so I shouldn't share it, but I also try to be realistic. Building a professional speaking business takes 2 to 5 years. It really does. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the most simple reason is that today, while we're filming this, it's 2025. I'm being booked for 2027 already. That means meetings are already planning for 2027. Now, does that mean I'm not going to still get booked for something later this year? Absolutely. But when you're thinking about big keynotes and big things like that, that's a forward-looking thing. So that's 2 years from today. So if I start my business today, chances are to get into some of these meeting cycles just takes 2 to 5 years. So that's the first thing. You've got to stick with it. So that's my first piece of advice. And then the second is you have to decide you want to be a professional speaker. And I think that's where so many people kind of waffle a little bit. They're like, I like speaking and I like getting paid to speak. And so they'll do it occasionally. They'll take $500 here, $1,000 there, $700 there, but they're not building a business. When you start talking about professional speaking fees, generally they're significantly higher, but they come with a lot more value. So when someone, I'll just use generic numbers because I don't like hard math. So let's just say my fee is $100, right? And a meeting planner comes back and they say, $10 is our budget. I said, that's so great. I would love to refer you to some people who might be able to do that for $10, but let me explain to you why. And I basically say, here's where that other $90 is made up. And I have this little sheet that I send them, it goes into marketing. When you hear me speak, you get research, and it's tons of research that goes into this. For every minute I'm on stage, when I'm writing a new talk, I've spent at least 1 hour researching and prepping for that. And so I start to build, you're getting a team with me, you're getting marketing with me, you're getting, a bunch more oomph with me. And so that's the difference between working with a professional speaker. And a lot of times we can meet and they say, oh, I understand. And almost always after the fact, they're like, now I see what the difference was working with someone who I paid to speak versus a professional speaker.
That's so interesting the way you presented that, because I think that there's this perception that, you can just, state a rate and they're going to be either, yay or nay to it, but going back and saying, and here's the value that I'm providing, and then outlining that very specifically, that builds your credibility and your case for why they should be paying the fee that you are suggesting. And I always feel like if you make your rate too low, you're really selling yourself short, because it's hard to raise it once you've set it at such a low rate.
Absolutely.
And speaking fees, I imagine that is an art and science unto itself. How do you figure out? Like, do you always charge the same rate? Do you, what do you suggest to people who are trying to figure out which
yeah, I've got a video that I put together. You can look it up on fee integrity, which is this big conversation in the speaking world, and I use the example, and I won't get into it because it's a pretty long example, but basically it's, do you take the same fee no matter what? And if my fee is $100, I'm never taking 99, or do you take $7 sometimes, $120 sometimes? And where's the ethics and all that? It's a big conversation, right? But this idea of fee integrity. And for me, what I find is when you price yourself, I do find you can change that over time, especially there are certain accolades you might get throughout your career, new degrees, bestseller status, some other endorsement that might be able to allow you to elevate that. But I think when I help people craft their speaking fee, I look at what the market is that they're playing in and how many times they want to speak per year too. I know one speaker friend who loves to be on the road. They just absolutely love to travel. They're retired from their corporate job. They take family members with them. They make a trip out of everything that they do. And they basically live like 300 and some days on the road. That's their lifestyle that they've chosen. And so they take a very, very low speaker fee, but they make 6 or 7 figures every year taking that lower speaker fee because they want to be super accessible. I know other people who have earned some accolades and they take a very, very high, almost 6-figure one-time fee. And they speak only several times a year, but that's all that they want to do. So again, there are so many factors that go into it. That's, a very long conversation in and of itself. And it is part art, part science. And you do have to have some trial and error. And I definitely take a couple engagements that are lower than my fee, but I also have the back office to support that. Meaning I've got other sales streams, book sales, product sales, course sales, consulting that, I'll take a pretty low fee if I know that I'm going to get a back end off of it as well.
Yeah, and you do talk about the importance of revenue streams when you are a professional speaker, and that is really helpful in your book as well. So let's actually get into kind of the nitty gritty of, okay, you've got this business. What are some of the best practices for professional speakers? One of the things that I found interesting was you ask certain questions before an event. What are those questions that you're always asking of the meeting organizer?
Yeah, I think the biggest one's who's in the room, right? One day I can be speaking to environmentalists. The next day I can be speaking to pet influencers. And there's literally going to be pets in the room. This is happening in a couple of weeks. And so you just never know who's going to be in the room. And I don't share this story in the book, but I basically went to an event. I won't even say the industry, but I thought I knew what the industry was. It was in the broader category of agriculture. I'll say that. And I thought I knew who I was talking to. I thought I was talking to farmers effectively. I wasn't. I was talking to executives of retail stores,
Oh no.
in this industry. And I didn't take the time to ask who was in my room. And so that's the simple question, right? Who's in your room? Then depending on your talk, how do you identify how your talk solves the biggest problems for the people in the room? Even if it's a motivational leadership keynote, those people still have problems and you're on stage to solve them or give them insight or give them a glimmer of hope. And so understanding those two questions really are the only two questions you need to ask. Now, I like to go deeper. I like to unpack, and depending on the meeting or the industry, if it's new, I was just in an industry that I never had dealt with before, and thought I knew what they did. And turns out they were the ones who used to inspect the 1 hour photo stations. It's not in their title, has nothing to do, but that's one of the biggest changes in the last 10 years or 20 years, because camera development doesn't work anymore, or it doesn't exist anymore. It's digital. And so that was something that, like, those aha moments. And when you just weave that in 10 seconds to your presentation, everyone like, oh, they know me. And those little things are so valuable.
Yeah, making it so relatable. So how do you prepare for a talk beyond just knowing who's in the room? Like, what does that look like for you?
So thankfully, being able to give so many presentations a year, my presentations don't change very much. But every single one's custom tailored, right? We can all go to J. Crew, Brooks Brothers, and all buy the same shirt. But if we go to a tailor, they're going to tweak it just a little bit. So we're wearing the same shirt, but it fits us differently. And so I do the same thing with my presentations. I rarely do custom presentations, partly because the few times I've done that, it ends up poorly for everybody. And I just know that that's a weakness of mine. I've accepted engagements to custom tailor something or to create something new instead of custom tailor it. And it just doesn't work well. So I take what I have and I say, okay, how does this fit into your industry? And I'll even walk through certain stories or illustrations to make sure they relate to the audience. And I've got a whole library of stories. So I had one event that booked me twice, 2 years in a row for the same exact talk. And I tried so hard. I said, no, I don't want to sit in front of the same audience 1 year apart at the same conference, giving the same talk. They're like, well, everyone loved it so much. So I said, okay, well, here's the stories and illustrations I used for the same talk last year. I'm just going to, same point, same everything. I'm going to change the stories. And so those little things are kind of how I prepare. There are several events that are recurring every year or every couple of years. Make sure that I don't repeat. So I save all my presentations, all my illustrations, and I record every single session I do, even if it's just audio. And so I can go back through and make sure that I'm, bringing fresh new content to them, even if I'm called back.
You touched upon what I was going to ask you about next, which is the value of recording yourself. For you, it's creating an archive of content, but for those who are, perhaps early in their professional speaking career, you consider recording yourself and reviewing it to be a really critical piece. I do that a lot with my training. I make people, record themselves and then we watch it back together and I give them feedback. But why do you consider it to be so important for a professional speaker to do that?
Yeah, I write about it 2 different times in the book because I think it's so important. It's 2 different chapters. But one is talking specifically about game tape and the importance. And I don't like sports analogies generally, but just use one there. Because you don't know what you don't know. And the adrenaline rush when you get on stage, no matter how many times you do it, you say things, do things that you just don't even know are happening. Even if you're on autopilot and you're giving the same talk over and over again, you could do it in your sleep. And one case in point was humiliating to me. Huge keynote last year. And so I'm, 700, 800 professional presentations in my life. By no means an expert, but I've done this a couple times. And all of a sudden I start doing this. For those of you watching the video or not watching a video, I've got like my fingers on my chin making this triangle. Okay. I've never done that in my entire life. I don't know where that came from. And it was like, I don't know if it was a nervous tick, and something happened immediately before I got on stage that I also read about in a different chapter that threw me off my game a little bit. And then something happened on that stage. There's actually like 3 chapters that have pieces of that keynote woven in. Yeah. But it was horrifying to me when I watched that back because I had no idea I had done it till about a month later when the AV team sent me that video. So I think no matter how experienced you are, you might not have to rewatch every single presentation, but you're going to develop new tics, new mannerisms, just things you didn't even know. And I think that's why recording and watching back is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your perspective on this. You've been a professional speaker for some time. How have you seen the business change over the years that you've been doing it?
Yeah, the business is changing quick. And obviously 2020 put a huge kind of fork in the road, allowing virtual presentations. A lot of my research and a lot of my presentations are on generational dynamics. And I do think we're going to see an increase again in in-person events. You see that authenticity and desire from Gen Z, but they're not going to be these massive 30, 40,000 people trade shows with, a ballroom with a, 5,000 person keynote. They're going to change. They're going to be much more experiential, much more engaged. And so, it is changing a lot. And I think you have to be creative and adapt. And I think the one other thing, and we said it before we got on air, not everyone's a keynoter. And in fact, if you look at the pyramid of professional speaking, the very top, the piece you see above the water is keynotes. And that's what everyone wants to be because that's what they see. But the bulk of the money and the bulk of the opportunities fall below the water. And those are trainings and educational workshops and even coaching, some other aspects of professional speaking. And so I think diversifying and realizing that keynotes are not the end all be all. Sure, you might make the most money per hour, but it's also harder to get the gigs. You're going to get fewer of them and they're going to get less and less. And I am seeing them move more towards celebrity speakers, more than traditional keynotes, unless it's corporate. But again, we can unpack all of that for a long time. So I'd say figure out what your niche is, double down on your niche. And once you've mastered your niche, then of course you can go and expand beyond, but you've really got to prove yourself and hone your craft and realize that, those big stadium stages are getting fewer and fewer, and that's okay. You can still have meaningful impact with people, but you just have to figure out what that means for you and your message.
Yeah. And that speaks to one of your core values that you mentioned in the book is, it doesn't have to be a room full of 1,000. If it's a room full of one person, that still is a really important talk. And why do you feel that way? Why do you kind of live that out anytime you are giving a speech, whether it's 1 or 1,000?
Yeah, I think we all love, as human beings, I think we love the idea to motivate and move people. It's just something that I think is innate in many humans, especially driven humans that have really aspirational goals. But the reality is, a lot of us, if you can know one story, the story of one person you've changed, that's what keeps you going. And I'll never forget when I wrote my third book. The day it came out, I was speaking at an event just coincidentally. It was not great for the book release, but I learned. Anyway, someone started crying in the front row, and this was not an emotional keynote at all. And basically she came and told me, she's like, I was in a fight with my daughter before coming in here, and what you said, and I was talking about generational dynamics and communication across the generations, made me understand why I've had a conflicted relationship with my parents and why my daughter and I got into a fight before I got in the car to come. And for me, I was talking about generations and how to be a leader. And that totally flipped it on its head for me. And every single time I give that talk now, I basically include like, hey, this is not for corporate America only. This is for everybody, and you can apply it. And so I think just knowing that if you impact one person, that's the story that's going to stick in your head, and that's going to motivate you and give you the fuel to keep going. And so that's why even if you get to impact one person, most people don't get to help change one person's life. And so I think that's worth it all.
Yeah, what a gift. Goodness. So I always end these conversations with the same question. Do you have one big takeaway for our audience, from the conversation that we had, that would be something that they can think about and chew on until the next episode comes out?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is if you want to become a professional speaker, stick with it. You're creating a business, right? It is a small business. It is something that you have to invest in and grow, and it takes time, energy, and often a little bit of money to build your platform. Don't give up. I see so many people give up after year 2 or year 3, and I see so many people start making it around year 3, 4, or 5. And it's so sad to me where people are almost there and they just throw in the towel. So if you want to be a professional speaker, just keep going. And if professional speaking isn't for you, that's totally fine. Just respect the professional speakers that are on stage, because they go through a lot of tough stuff to be where they are sometimes.
Yes, and you outline many instances of that in the book, Speak Goodr. So Ryan, thank you so much for sharing kind of your roadmap to becoming a professional speaker, but also sharing some insights on how you do what you do, but also, your whole philosophy behind it. I think it's really valuable for me and for our listeners. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Karin.
As you can probably tell from our conversation, Ryan and I are very much aligned on the philosophy behind what makes for an effective communicator, an effective speaker. And one of the things that I always talk about is how the best speakers are steeped in authenticity. In this week's bonus content, I talked to Ryan about a pivotal moment in his career where that came through loud and clear. So if you want to hear that snippet of conversation, there's my authenticity. I encourage you to go to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content. Once again, that's speakerdynamics.com/bonus content to hear Ryan give an insight into one of the pivotal moments of his career when the importance of authenticity came through. So I want to thank you all for sticking with the Speaker Dynamics Own the Room podcast and being loyal listeners and loyal viewers. Truly appreciate it. Please feel free to pass along the podcast to friends, to colleagues who you think might find value in it. It's so exhilarating to see this community being built. So with that in mind, until next time, everybody.